In this video for section 1.5, we're going to be talking about a second method for solving quadratic equations, and that's called the square root property. And the square root property we can use if we have something squared equal to a number. Now that something could just be a variable like x squared, or it could be something more complicated in parentheses, like x plus a squared, a is going to be a number, or x minus a squared. So when we're using the square root property, then we get two solutions. So u squared is equal to our number. So for example, if u squared is equal to 25, then u could be equal to the square root of that number, so 5, or the negative square root of that number, which would be negative 5. Because both 5 and negative 5, when you square them, you get positive 25. So there are two ways that I can write this. One is I could enter 5 and negative 5, or I could use the plus or minus symbol, which you're going to see at the bottom of the screen, and that's going to go in front, so it would be plus or minus 5. Now, the only time you can't use the plus or minus symbol is, for example, if you have two whole numbers. So if I had something like this, 2 plus or minus 1, then my lab is going to want you to actually do the calculations. So you would do 2 plus 1 and get 3. You would do 2 minus 1 and get 1. And so your answer set would be 1 and 3. So the process for solving. You need to get the square term by itself first on one side, whether that's just x squared or it's a set of parentheses, and then you need to take the square root of both sides. And this is the step where you need to remember to put in that plus or minus symbol. That's probably the most common way to make a mistake on these problems, is to forget that symbol. Step 3 is to solve the resulting equations. So sometimes you're going to need to do a little bit more work, like we did right here, to get down to the actual answer. So example 2 from the textbook, solve by the square root property. First step here is going to be to add 15 to both sides. And the second step is going to be to divide by 3. Now the process for getting the x squared by itself is the same as the process if it were just x. Get rid of things that are added or subtracted first, and then get rid of things that are multiplied. So that gives me x squared equals 5. Now this is where I am going to take the square root of both sides, and you can think of square root and square as canceling each other out. So my left side is just going to be x, and this is where I need to remember that plus or minus square root of 5. So when you're entering your answers, you always want to check with these to make sure that the square root cannot be further simplified. And we talked about how to simplify square roots earlier. You need to think about, are there any factors of the number under the square root that are perfect squares? So can it be divided by 4, 9, 16, 25, etc.? And if it can, then you need to simplify it. In this case, square root of 5 cannot be simplified because 5 cannot be divided by any perfect squares, and so that's going to be my answer. So again, the two ways that I could enter this into the homework is plus or minus square root of 5, or I could write square root of 5, comma, negative square root of 5. Remember, when you're entering answers in the homework, you would not put the x equals inside the squiggly bracket. So next we're going to look at part B. This is pretty similar. I'm going to start by subtracting 25 from both sides, and then I need to divide by 9. Now I'm going to leave it as 25 over 9 because generally in the homework they want you to enter things as fractions, not as decimal approximations. So what I'm going to do next is take the square root of both sides, and that gives me x on the left side. Now the right side is a little bit more complicated. I'm going to break up the square root over the numerator and denominator. And then I need to remember that plus or minus as well. So we're going to have plus or minus. Now square root of negative 25 I can simplify. Remember, when you have a negative under the square root sign, then that becomes I. So this is going to be plus or minus 5i, and square root of 9 is 3. So it would look like that. So when I go to type this in, I could type plus or minus 5i over 3, or 5i over 3, comma, negative 5i over 3. Either one is fine. So now we're going to look at C. This one is a little bit different because it has the parentheses. And thinking about solving, remember we go backwards through order of operations. So we need to get the exponent of 2 out of here before we undo the minus 2 in parentheses. Parentheses is the last thing that we undo. So we get rid of the exponent of 2 by taking the square root of both sides. And don't forget that plus or minus, so we have x minus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 6. Now I have some additional solving to do to get the x by itself. I need to add 2 to both sides. So that would be positive 2, or just 2, plus or minus square root of 6. So I can enter that as 2 plus minus square root of 6. Or as two separate numbers, 2 plus square root of 6, comma, 2 minus square root of 6. So next you should look at the 3 problems in checkpoint 2. Do these in your notes, check your answers, and then move on with the rest of the video. We're going to do one last example here of a problem that you're going to see in the homework. It says to use the compound interest formula, A equals P times 1 plus R to the T power, to find the annual interest rate if in 2 years an investment of $1,000 grows to $1,210. So what I need to do first here is identify what my variables are. So 2 years is going to be the time. So T is going to equal 2. The original investment is $1,000. That's the principal, which is the P, the initial amount invested. And the current amount, or the amount after the 2 years, is $1,210. So that's A. R is what I'm trying to find. So I'm going to plug these in. 1210 equals 1,000 times 1 plus R, plug in 2 for T. Now I'm going to solve for R. Now the first thing I need to do is get the parentheses by itself, so I need to get rid of 1,000. I do that by dividing, since it's multiplied by the set of parentheses. And that gives me 1.21 equals 1 plus R squared. Next step is getting rid of that square, and I do that by taking the square root of both sides. So square root of 1.21. Now I'm going to put the plus or minus here. We're going to talk in a second about why we don't need it. But plus or minus 1.1 equals 1 plus R. And then the last step to getting R by itself is subtracting 1 from both sides. So we have R equals negative 1 plus or minus 1.1. Now, if I do the plus, negative 1 plus 1.1, that's 1/10, 0.1. And then I'm going to have to enter my answer here as a percentage. So converting decimals to percents, you move the decimal point 2 places. So this is 10%. Or multiply by 100. If I do the negative, negative 1 minus 1.1, that's negative 2.1, which would give me an answer of negative 210%. Now, that doesn't really make sense because if the interest rate were negative, then my value of my investment would be decreasing. But it didn't decrease, it increased by $210. So I can't have a negative percentage in this situation. That doesn't make sense. So a lot of times in real world problems that have quadratic equations, you get two answers, but one of the answers doesn't make sense in the context of the problem, and so you can just disregard it. And so my answer here would be 10%. So next you should do the homework problems for this section.